name is Hans Polder. I work in the Netherlands at Wageningen Livestock Research, and I'm the coordinator of the Transport Guide project. But I'm not the only one involved in the project. Here are the logos of 16 partners in this endeavor who together in 3 years' time hope to produce guides and tell as many people as possible in Europe about the guides for transportation. The first thing, of course, I'd like to tell you is the aims of the project. And our project aims to provide or to develop guides to good and best practices on the transportation of livestock species in the European Union. And when we talk about livestock species, we talk about the 5 that you see pictured here. So that's horses, cattle, pigs, poultry and sheep. And the second main objective is, after doing that, to reach as many people as possible, a large number of transport companies, drivers, competent authorities, farmers, NGOs, who are involved in animal transportation, and tell them about good practices and tell them about best practices that they can use in their everyday business. We developed the guides in a number of different steps, and I'll just do it very broadly to spare you all the details of the project, but you can imagine that it's a rather complex, or rather more complex than these 3 sentences. But in 3 sentences, what we do is we've collected a lot of written evidence from wherever we could find it on what are good and best practices to transport animals. Then we discuss these within our own countries at national level with stakeholders, and I know some of you have been involved in these stakeholder discussions at national level. And then, and this is what we're doing currently, we take it to the international level, where in focus groups, which consist of experts from different types of organizations which preferably work internationally, in focus groups we will write the final deliverables. And this activity is currently ongoing. In fact, this afternoon, at least for 3 species, the horses, the poultry and the cattle, we will have separate meetings and we will continue our discussions on the details of the different practices. Ultimately, the practices will look something like this, and we haven't got them yet, so I can't show them to you, but just to give you an impression. The final practices, the final guidelines, will compose of 2 sets of information. One set of information is more or less a detailed description of the good and best practices that we agreed with the different focus groups on the species. So they'll introduce the topic, give maybe some background on certain aspects. They'll tell us what the legislative status is in the European legislation, and then they will provide good practices and best practice suggestions. And for clarity, I think it's important to state that what we consider to be a good practice is a practice which is a direct interpretation of the legislation. So you take legislation, and if it says it's 75 centimeters, then it's clear it should be 75 centimeters. But if it says it should be sufficient, then we, together, collectively, will think of what is sufficient. What do we consider to be the good practice, what the legislation means in this case. That's good practice. Best practice is where transport companies or farmers or others involved in the chain want to give a little bit extra, want to do a little bit more. Maybe for their customers, because their customers demand it, maybe because of their own philosophy on how to transport animals. But it's a level, an extra space or bedding or extra whatever on top of what is legally required. So that's the difference between what we call a good practice and a best practice. And you can debate whether that's right or wrong, but this is what we're doing. So it's handy that we all understand what we're doing in this project. That's one set. Then the second set of information that we hope to produce are, and I should first explain, this is particularly aimed at those people who need to interpret the legislation, be it from the competent authority point of view, or be it from a transporter point of view, or be it from a trainer or an instructor who trains people on transportation. They will have to be able not to read a book from A to Z the whole way through, but they have to be able to look something up. Where can I find how you plan a journey, or how you, I don't know, judge whether an animal is fit to travel, or things like that. Okay? So it's a sort of encyclopedia, if you like. That's this bit. Additionally, what we hope to produce is on the core issues, there where we know that on the shop floor, on the working floor, on the everyday working floor, there is a need for direct information. We hope to produce fact sheets. We call them now fact sheets, but they may be called differently in the future. And they could be things like, okay, before the animals are loaded, we have to tick this, that, that, and that. So we produce a fact sheet on, a checklist on checking animals before they go. Or before I go on a journey, it's good to have a certain number of things on a separate sheet of paper in case there's an emergency. What do I need in case there's an emergency? I need telephone numbers, I need an alternative route, I need to know where the control post is, etc., etc. Now, these are extra things that we produce in addition to this, and the target group is not necessarily the trainers. In this case, the target group are the users, the end users who are involved in the transportation of animals. In the process of doing that and working with you in the national stakeholder groups, but also in the international focus group, we received a lot of questions from the different stakeholder groups on, yeah, but what does the Commission mean when they say that these are guidelines? I mean, will the guidelines become law? Ultimately, it's a question that we heard many times. And we can give you the answer, because of course we've asked exactly the same questions to the Commission ourselves when we were negotiating and discussing about the content of the project. But it's far better if we can answer these questions, or have these questions answered directly from the Commission themselves. So that's the main purpose of this meeting. That's to give you the opportunity to talk directly with Denis Simonin, who's the project officer, the scientific officer from DG Santé for this particular project, on the questions that you may have on the deliverables, on how they're going to be used, on the intentions that the Commission has with this project. That will be the first part of our meeting today. After I stop talking, Denis will present his views on the project and will give you plenty of opportunity to engage in the discussion. And the discussion will be moderated by our deputy coordinator, and that is Kees Roest, who's also organized this meeting, as you know, because you all received invitations from him. After that, we'll have a brief coffee break, and then we split up in 3 focus groups. And hopefully the majority of you will be linked to one of the focus groups. I know some of you have to go away, but the majority of you will be involved either in the discussions on poultry, which will be here in this building, or in the discussions on cattle transport, the guides for cattle, or the guides for horse transportations, which both are at Avenue ter Vuren, one at IRU, the International Road Transport Union, who's one of the members in our consortium, and the other one at FVE, the Federation of Veterinarians of Europe, who are one of the other members of our consortium. So that's later today. Let's start with the first part, unless there are some immediate questions to me now, which we shouldn't keep until later. Any explanation required further? Nope, all clear? Then I'd like to invite Denis to give his presentation.
As you know, my name is Denis Simonis. I'm the head of sector of the animal welfare in the unit. And I will try to present you the overall context of the project and to reply to some of the questions that might arise from this. So the title was given to the contractor, so best practice for animal transport, objective opportunities and limits. So I will try to do this. animal transport, and but also on any EU legislation on animal welfare, the mantra today from a political side is better enforcement. And I think this is particularly relevant for animal transport. We still receive complaints and reports of things that are not working well enough. And I think that it's true that enforcement is particularly sensitive for transport because a number of structural reasons. Many actors, many different types of people who are transporting animals. The fact that it's easy to come into the transport business as well. You have, people from different backgrounds who are transporting animals. So it's clear that enforcement is probably something a bit delicate. The other thing that makes enforcement difficult is that, transport by essence is moving. So for competent authority, they are always, it's like catching something that is always moving. So it's difficult. You cross competences, you change of country to country, you change to regional officer to regional officer. So enforcement is particularly difficult, and that's why I think the idea of better training, better support for, transport who are really responsible for their business is much more important than in any other areas of animal welfare. If you have a farm, you can go to the farm and check. If you have a truck, well, the truck is always moving, so it's better to have a good driver. So for that reason, there was a pilot project which was on the budget 2014, and this was, it's important for you to know that this kind of pilot project comes from the European Parliament. So the European Parliament can decide to have extra budget for a particular temporary project, and this is one of them, where they give us, I think, say, €1 million, I think if I am correct, to develop, and then I use the word which has been designed by the fund, bring best practices to life and disseminate them among stakeholders. So these were the two main mandates of the Parliament. And because the Commission thought it was a very good idea, then, we agreed with the Parliament, and we launched a procedure of contract of 3 years, which started last year, which was given to the consortium of today. And it's called Best Practices for Animal Transport. But first, the scope, it has already been said. This is the scope which is part of the contract. So there are a number of specific group of animals. I would say it's not only species, but group of animals. They all chicks are laying hens, broilers are precisely put in the contract. Transported by road and rail vessels. It means that we don't speak about livestock vessels, we don't speak about transport by air. This is clearly excluded from the contract. And we have also asked the contractor to take particular or bring particular attention to cull animals, because it's, in my view, it's really a particular problem. To also focus on developing, if possible, animal-based indicators. And I've also to think or to reflect which will be the best format to disseminate the information. So these are not on the content, but more on the format, and this is also important because we have the experience in the field of animal welfare that you can design fantastic, and you can collect fantastic information, and then it's dropped in a cupboard because, it's purely in English and is designed in a way which is which is difficult to translate into the ground for people who are busy or do not necessarily want to go into deep on this. So it's very important also that the format is designed in a way which is accessible and in a way which can be step by step. I think that's it's not only a matter of level of education, but also a matter of time. Sometimes, if you're a business, so you have a business for transport. If you are the manager of the business, you don't have time to go into 150 pages. So you need to have some kind of where the information is accessible, where you can find what is relevant for you. So I ask also to the transporter to do this. So the phases of the project is year number 1 was to collect key references, and draft the guide, so good and best practices. I will come back to this again. Year 2, consult stakeholders, so this is the phase number 2, and for the contractor to draft the final guide. And year 3, to disseminate, means to give to make this outcome known among the stakeholders or in the member states. To come back to this concept of good and best practices, What I want to, I'm afraid, Hans, I have to contradict a bit what you say. It's not about interpretation, okay? Because for us, interpretation has a specific meaning in legal terms, okay? Interpretation means that you have a law, you have a statement in the law, and interpretation means this what it means. And in my opinion, the good practices is not about legal interpretation. From a purely strictly legal point of view, legal interpretation is only the Court of Justice of the EU who is entitled to have what we call a legally binding interpretation of the law. So even the Commission ourselves, we don't have this possibility. We can give our opinions, okay, the contractor can give his opinion, but this is not the purpose of the exercise. I think the purpose of good practices is more to make you know how a legal requirement is translated into practice among the stakeholders, or how the views exist among the stakeholders. So it's not like you have to take, let's say, a hamburger, okay? No, this is not this. It is part of the menu. You can take a hamburger, you can take a vegan if you want, or you can take a salad, or you can take something else. This is the idea of the best practices. And it's more like a menu of how you can translate into practice legal requirements and what is available and what is feasible in practice, rather than a legal interpretation. So that's a bit, I know that for people who are a bit technical, it's translated into legal interpretation. But it's not the fact that, for example, there is good practices which is laid down in the document, that means that a legal officer can go to your court with this. It's still something can be challenged, because the contractor has no authority or no legal authority to design a legal interpretation of the law. So I think this is important, that you clearly understand the difference between good practices, which is what is the way something is translated, because you have a lot of requirements which can be a bit open to discussion, and what is a legal interpretation where it says you have to do it. Okay, so this I want to clarify, and if there are other questions on this, I'm happy to give example. So what is the opportunities of this project? Okay, is providing tools to apply legislation. So legal requirement, exactly what I said, legal requirements into practice. If you say you have to give enough food for the animals, okay, it's nice, but how you do that? So a good practice would be, okay, for a travel of, let's say, how many times I can give hay every blah, 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 or I don't give anything, I don't know. But this is how you can translate it into practice. And also to have common reference with various options. It's important that also for the same requirements, you may have also different possibilities. That's why I speak about the menu, because there are many different ways sometimes to provide, to meet with the same legal requirements. And actually, I would like to emphasize that sometimes the legal requirements are a bit vague, because they state principles, because the legislature thought that there was so many possibilities and so many parameters to meet the requirement that they stay just with the principle in the law. And this is important, because then otherwise you over-legislate, you just give one solution where actually you can keep the animals well with different ways. And this is important to understand, that good practices could be several options. Proposing best practices, so that's what has been already explained, going beyond legislation, the areas where there is no legal requirement, why they are sometimes good practices that go beyond the legislation. And then debating on practical objectives. So it's important that the debate is not changing the law, okay, because this is not part of the contract, okay, and to be honest, is not even part of the legislative program of the Commission. So if you want to express your opinion on the fact that the legislation is badly designed and so on, fine, but it's completely useless, okay? It will not have any outcome. So you can complain, but it's, I think what is important, no, but I want to be clear, the contract is you work in a framework. So it's better for you to find how you can meet the requirement in a way which is practical and feasible, rather than complain about, this is not feasible, or this is bullshit, and so on. So be clear, this is not an open debate for the legislation. giving the floor also to all stakeholders, I think, is also a good way for you to share the practices and to exchange information. It could be between stakeholders, but also between countries. Practices and constraints are different, and this is important that you see that there are different perspectives. Sharing valuable information, okay, it's science into practice. There are many, the problem of knowledge is very often is not disseminated in a very homogeneous way. You have sometimes good sciences which is being done, but it's not known by the practitioner. So it's an opportunity for you to meet people who have a certain scientific background, and Hans and Case and other institutes who are here have this scientific background, okay. Practical experience. On the other side, transporters and operators may have also practical experience, something that can work or cannot work. And also beyond languages and sector barrier. What I mean is that languages is sometimes that the problem is sometimes something can be very well developed, an area of practice can be very well developed, let's say in Poland, and another one in Germany, and another one in Italy. But the sphere and the competence have never been shared. So the language barrier is not to be ignored. Here, maybe people are all familiar with English, but if you come back to your own country, I'm sure that people who are transporting animals are not necessarily fluent in English or whatsoever. So this is important, that to be conscious that some area of knowledge may not be shared just because there is people have been developed this at national or even regional level, and it's not known in other places because of the language. The sector barrier is the same. Some good practices may be done in the pig sector and not be done in the cattle sector, while some, I mean, you know, mammals, okay, they are different, but they may have also some communities as well. So that's important to be conscious that this is an opportunity also to share this information between what is usually a bit partitioned. Identification information gaps. It's clear that even if you do a lot of discussion and so on, you probably identify that there are big holes, okay? Because of species that are not necessarily having a lot of information, and also topics that may be not covered because it has never been an issue, for example. But it doesn't mean that it has to be covered by the good practices, but it's interesting also to identify that some areas may not be covered and may be a legal requirements which have never been translated into practice. So I think that's interesting to identify those gaps as well, because you might say, but this is maybe an area where we have to work. We have ignored this, but it's maybe an area where we have to work. Developing new approaches, okay. This is also an opportunity for discussing things that is not a legal requirement, but could be also a good way to apply requirements which are not clearly identified in the legislation. As I said, there are a number of principles that cannot be translated into what we call resource-based requirements. So we cannot say, for example, ventilation should, well, I think there is something on ventilation, but maybe you should provide how many liters of water for a cow, for example, okay, every day. This may be because it depends on temperature, and if it is in milking or not, and so on. So there are a number of things that maybe so many variables that you need to focus on other approaches. And developing animal-based indicator could be an opportunity for you to meet the requirement without necessarily having just one way of doing it with what we call a resource-based system. And also developing new approach about various educational materials. As I said, the format is important, and you may have in your own experience, a particular, say, oh yeah, this is very good to have a film. I know that in UK they have developed a film on transport. This was very good. It was very much appreciated. Or you say, no, we don't like the films. We prefer to have this, and so on. And the format also to share experiences on the format of educational materials is also important, because you probably see there are good and bad experiences in this regard. Okay, the limits, okay, of the exercise. So it should be the problem of legitimacy of the document. It's clear that we had a small discussion with Hans. Okay, first of all, it should be science-based, or this is when it's possible, okay, I'm not saying that science is always available, but when possible it should be science-based, because otherwise you speculate. You know, you can say, I feel that the animals should be treated this way. Okay, fine, it's interesting, but okay, factually speaking, it's not really something that's not necessarily true. So when possible, it always should be argumented with science. This is very important. Otherwise, or in complement, it has to be also validated by practical experience and the feasibility. It's clear that, you know, if you read sometimes a scientific report, and like scientists, I'm not criticizing scientists, but sometimes, okay, what is good in science is not feasible because transporter is operating in an environment which is an economic environment, which is a practical environment. There are many other constraints. Even the speed limit of the trucks or whatever, I mean the height of the trucks, and there are many other things that influence the transport, and what should be optimal is not necessarily feasible. So it's important that also the guides are validated by practical experience feasibility. And the last point for a good legitimacy is, or the limit of it, is a consensus among major stakeholders. So I said to Hans, because he said, well, sometimes views are so different that it's very difficult to, yes, I know. This is part of democracy in general, okay? When you consult people, they do not agree on everything. And there are many important stuff in life where, even more than transport of animals, where people do not agree, even 50%. So if you look at the Belgian election or the Spanish election, sometimes, you know, they don't have difficulties to set up a government. So it's an example which is, in my opinion, a bit more important in society than the transport of animals, where still you don't have consensus. So do not expect, and I said to Hans, do not expect to have a perfect consensus. This is it. But what is important is to try to get it, okay? And if there are minority opinions, fine, okay? People are free to express their minority opinion. But I think what is important is that at least the document reflects some kind of, general trends of what could be done, and it's scientifically based and feasible in practice. Now, the limit also is the economic feasibility. It's clear that new practices can be feasible, but sometimes it takes time and a new cost, of developing new practices. So it's clear that there is some recommendation that might be difficult to implement for people who are not used to them. It's clear that when you do something new, okay, it costs you something. But I think it's important that you also take this into consideration when you read the list of best practices, that you may have optimal practices, for example, that might be good, but it's clear that if you change the practice, then you have also to change your way of working, okay? I started my career where computers were not existing, you know, okay? No, it's true. And now I've changed my practices and my way of work, and the time I dedicate to what I was doing before is different. So, and it took time for a person who is not familiar with computer to learn what is a computer and to work with a computer. So that's the same with transport. You may have best practices that might you think, oh, no, I cannot do that. But it's interesting also to consider them because in the long term they might be also working. But it's true that it is a limit of some of the good practices. Expected benefit. So this is one of my mantra. Okay, so it's important that also there is a balance, okay, on animal welfare and other constraints, and it's true that operators have to choose, okay, between the different constraints. One of the things that brings to them, I think that will improve welfare in transport or other areas is the image of the sector. It's clear that when people see a problem or an accident or something that is terribly bad, okay, they blame all transporters, whatever the good ones or the bad ones. So even if you have 1% of bad guys, okay, you know, it's a bit like now we discuss about immigration. I know it's a very controversial subject, but you know, if there is something bad, it's always the immigrants, okay? So it's the same with transporter. If there is one guy who is bad, okay, it's all transporters. And this is what we call generalization. And I think we have to be careful, but it's true that more you build about the image of the sector, more you will have a solid way you can resist to this kind of generalization. Work motivation is also important. I think that for people around the field, these people who are working in animals, the fact that they are proud of their job is very important, okay? It will motivate them, and if they say, if they show to the people that they are doing well with the animals, they are proud of their work, and they will do it even better. So I think this is also, it looks a bit silly, but it's very important. Work motivation, in my view, is very important, especially for workers who are sometimes not very well paid and sometimes not very well recognized because they do a tough job. Meeting client specification, it's clear that transporting animals, sometimes, okay, you have a client, and if the animals arrive dead or in a bad condition or they die within the few days afterwards, okay, I don't think that is a good job. So you have some benefits of showing to your client that working well with animals can also have a good effect. And also sometimes saving cost and better process monitoring. There are many evidence now showing that when you deal with welfare on your process, whether it be farming or transport or slaughter, if you monitor animal welfare, you will discover things on your overall chain and your process quality. So the fact that you survey animals will probably bring you a number of benefits that you do not expect for the moment. So it's important because animal welfare-based indicators, for example, if you look at the animals, you will have a closer look at what is going on, and then you will discover that things can be improved. So animal welfare is part of the improvement process of quality of the job of transporters. Effectiveness, so I already developed this, accessibility and readability of materials, level of language use. So it's clear that even the contractor will do an effort to make it more accessible. I think you have also to be conscious that if you are part of the process, you will have to use them and also to translate you into your own language. And it's not a matter of language in sense of English and Spanish or whatsoever. It's also a matter of how you speak to people. Okay, you have always a need to translate it to the audience. And the scale of the dissemination is important that now the contractor has the obligation to do some minimum work on dissemination, but also I want to emphasize that you all will be also part of the process in the sense that it's up to you also to take part of the process of dissemination when the materials will be available. Interest for progress, motivation to apply. Okay, of course it's a limit. Okay, if nobody cares about them, okay, you will know where. And integration to that is also important. That part of the success of the project will also depend on how the best practices are integrated in the professional practice, and if it's integrated in some of the public or the private voluntary standards. That's important, but it depends not on the project itself, but it's a limit of the project. Conclude and to leave you the floor, I think it's important that you contribute to the project. As I said, democracy is two sides. Okay, if you contribute, okay, you will be listened. Okay, not all your views may be taken on board, but okay, you will have to contribute to the process. If you don't contribute to the process because you think that it's not valuable, it takes time and so on, then decision will be taken out of you. Okay, that's the rule of life. Let's say. Huh? It's a dynamic process. Okay, it means that do not expect that this document when you will stay, and we are not going to make it every year. But what I mean is that it's up to the people who will use this document to make it dynamic and to renew it. So it's a basis, let's say, but it's really up to the stakeholders then to use it and to transform it. If it stays like in a museum, it's not, you have no interest. It's important that you consider that good practices are a dynamic process. And I think what is one of the objectives of the project is also to try to establish a certain level of confidence between actors, okay? So that there are ways of dialogue, and I hope that after the project, people will continue to speak and together, at least, and exchange information. And to conclude also on this, I think what is important is not to go into very theoretical debate or try to discussion on philosophical things. I think for me the most important thing is to get concrete achievements, to do really things that has an impact on the animals. That's it. And now I'm open for you.
Thank you very much, Denis Simonin, for this interesting presentation. I think perhaps you are already answered to some of the questions of the audience, because there are a few comments which are very much of interest. We already given the reply to some questions, but of course we are now opening the session for questions. So I would like to ask and it's also video registered. So when you are talking, you are also video registered. Why? Because the pig group and the group of the sheep stakeholders are not here, and we will put it also on the website, so that it will be possible for everybody to be sort of open information for everybody, that there is nothing to hide here, and that this is something which everybody should know what we are talking about, and that also other stakeholders who are not in this meeting will be familiar with the outcome of this discussion. So who will be the first who would like to pose a question to Denis Simonin about the presentation, and about the objectives and the limits of the guides he has explained? Please, if you start to pose your question, first state your name and for what organization you are working for.
So I'm Julie Maillot and I work for the poultry producers in France. So maybe the first question is a big one, but I think we have a great consensus among the French producers of poultry. And the consensus is that for us, we have to focus on the good practices, because it's the first step, and we know that we have to focus on the things that are in the regulation and how to implement the regulation. And so we think that the best practices should be out of the scope of the guide for a first step. For us, it is very important to have good practices and to disseminate it among the European producers and be sure that they are implemented in all the countries. But for the best practices, we think it is too soon, and we don't have all the material, the scientific material, and the thing we need to define those practices, those best practices. So we would like to focus on the good for a first step.
My name's Leslie from Eyes and Animals. Just to add to what you said, I was also concerned, I understand in democracy we cannot always have a full consensus where everyone agrees, but will there be some sort of official check by the EU DG Sanko that at least the consensus that is finally written on paper is correct according to the essence of the EU legislation? And in particular with chicken transport, for example, there is an article in the law that says you're not allowed to lift up or hoist animals by the leg, and yet that's done all over the place during catching and loading of chickens. But we do have a best practice that we'd love to put in that's got started in Holland, where they're now applying the Swedish method, which is picking them up upright, not by their leg. And there's a lot of scientific evidence that shows that that lowers corticosterone hormones and heart rates. So we'd love the best practice to still be in. Thanks.
Luc Mirabito from Idele in France, and I'm part of the consortium, but I wanted to be sure that I right understood what Denis said, and in particular regarding the use of animal-based indicator, because my question is that, and maybe it's linked to the other question, sometimes we have difficulties and problem of feasibility or economic feasibility of with some requirements. Can we imagine in the guide to have some animal-based indicator instead of clear requirements on practice to guarantee animal welfare? And is it an option that we can use in the guide, and because it can help to solve some issue we have in the practice, and maybe it's also linked with the difference between good and best practice, because sometimes it's not so easy to make the difference. Okay. But I want to be sure that I right understood what you said a few minutes ago.
My question is really about the future of the final guide and who will sort of own it. You said it should be a dynamic document and capable of being changed, which I'd certainly support. But I think it's important we're clear about who actually sort of controls that process. And do you see this as something that the Commission would adopt the guidance and take responsibility for for ownership of it?
Okay. Well, the first question is not a question; it's a statement. So I don't have to reply to it. I'm sorry, because you say, okay, we have the opinion, we do that. Okay, fine. Okay, it's your opinion. So it's not a question for me. The contract foresee best practices. So that's. But I appreciate that you want to focus on good practices. Then the second question is the official checks. Okay, this is a delicate question. Okay, we have a practical problem here. Okay, we try, let's say. Okay, but I think that's the exercise we try. It means that the draft that you receive has already been read by some commercial officials. But it's clear that because of, our actual resources today, and the fact that we have other tasks to do, we are not perfect. So I think it's also your role to check that there is some kind of, if you see or if you have doubt on the compatibility of some good practices and the legal requirement, this is really when you can express it, okay? So, because I have the experience of this kind of checks of documents, especially on training materials done by contractors, and it's clear that, okay, it's so detailed that presently we cannot go into the checks and say, well, we are sure that this is compatible or not. We scan it, okay, we read them, okay, so we are paid for it, but, okay, we are not perfect. So that's why I want to emphasize, and you might have different views on how legal requirements are translated into practice. So yes, we do it, but I cannot assure you, and if you see that there is something that is missing or something that is wrong, of course you have to express it to the contractor. Or to us, okay? It's fine. Now, on the animal-based indicators, I think this is a very good question, and I think they are in the legislation, let's say, to make it a bit, simplify, two kind of requirements. Some that are mainly based on objectives, so which are fairly vague. We do not specify any resource particular. They say you should make sure that the animals are not get any unnecessary suffering. This is a kind of principle, okay? In practice, how you do that, it's not really practical. And some others where you have to say, let's say, temperature in the transport should not exceed 30 degrees, okay? Well, that is really very resource-based, very specific requirements. Okay, you can measure 30 degrees. It's more, or it's less or more, but it's something that you can measure. So when you have no resource-based requirement and you have only a principle, something that is fairly vague, okay, which is just only the principle, I think that animal-based indicators can perfectly, okay, translate this as a way to meet the legal requirements. I don't know if I'm clear in my reply. Is it okay what I'm saying? So let's say that if you have no legal requirement for temperature and you say that animals should be in a good comfort zone, for example, this is a general principle, then you can use an animal-based indicators because it's a way to put the legislation into practice. But if you have 30 degrees, it says it has to be 0, 30 degrees with a margin of tolerance of 5 degrees, which I think is the legislation. Then in this case, no, you can. You can use animal-based indicators as a best practices or as a complement. But you cannot argue with somebody, oh, it's 39, but it looks fine because we have an animal-based indicator. This will not be accepted. Okay, so it's clear that when you have a specific requirements, you can use animal-based indicators, but they will not replace them. But if you have no specific technical legal requirement, then I think that animal-based indicators can be perfectly used. But I'm not obsessed by this. You can have a mix of things. It's not this discussion about resource-based or animal-based is a bit, there is no opposition. You can use a mix of them so that you have, because some of the animal-based indicators are complicated to monitor, for example. So sometimes monitoring sweating on the animal is more complicated than take a temperature and monitor temperature. So that's why I'm saying that it should be also feasible and practical. Now, on the future of the guides, okay, what is control of the process? I have no reply yet, okay? I don't know, okay? First we produce, okay? They will disseminate for once, and then we will see how it works. I think what is important is that this experience will see as well how the sector is able to manage best practice and good practices. Yeah, there is a lot of discussion about to which extent we should legislate or not and so on. But we should also give, I mean, a certain chance for the sector to also use this guide to see how it works. Okay, because, and I think it will have also an effect for not only people who are transporting animals, but all the food supply chain. I think this is also what is interesting in these guides, even if they are not, okay, they probably will transform and change over the time. It's a good base to start working on a common basis. So I expect also other actors of the food chain to use them. That's the idea behind the good practices. That's it. Huh?
Thank you, Denis, for your first replies.
Aviagen from the Netherlands. Mr. Simonin, thank you very much for the explanation, but you've managed from when you started to confuse me totally between good practices and best practices. So if you could do me a favor, maybe I'm the only one, but I'm totally confused about it. Could you do me a favor and try and explain very clearly what you mean by good practice and best practice? Because if I listen to you in your talk, you sometimes mix them up by your own definitions that you stated before.
Would you please...
Really sorry if I confuse you about this. Okay, maybe it's because my expression is not good enough. Okay, I will try to clarify this. Okay, the idea is that there are a number of legal requirements that exist in the law, okay, in the regulation, that are binding. Some of these requirements are relatively vague or are based on principles or are not very specific into all details, because as I say, it's sometimes difficult to go into details. And the purpose of good practices, okay, is really to offer to people who want or have to implement them, give them the option how they can meet those requirements, those legal requirements. So this is really linked to meeting the requirements. It's not interpretation, okay? And maybe I confuse yourself by this issue of interpretation. It means that is a way you can, is an offer how you can meet the requirement, but you still have to meet the requirement in one way or another. Let's say, for example, if you say animals should not suffer from thirst, okay, during the transport, it's a general principle. And if it's translated into, I give to my animal, let's say, 5 liters a day, okay, this is a good practice. It means that you have a procedure, you have a way you meet the legal requirement of not then make the animal thirsty, okay? So this is a good practice. If you say to me, well, I don't have any practice, then I'm not happy as an inspector. Because I say, you have a legal requirement about animals should be thirsty, but you don't know how to translate to it. For me, you are not meeting the requirements because you don't know. If you say, the animal is not thirsty, okay, that's not a good reply. So in this sense, good practices are a way or options to meet the legal requirements that are in the regulation. When you speak about best practices, the idea is to say, it's also an opportunity that some of the people who are working with animals design something that go beyond existing legal requirements, which are not necessarily existing.
To improve on something that is not existing. Are you trying to create something artificially to improve?
The legislation is not comprehensive. It means there are a number of good practices, or best practices, sorry, that could exist within the sector, which are not part of the legal requirement. For example, I don't know, I mean, I don't have something in mind now, but you can say that, for example, for avoiding that animals are thirsty, you have a system for monitoring them, which go beyond the legal requirement, for example, which is not necessary. We don't ask, let's say, in the legislation, that you should monitor the animals if the animals are thirsty during the transport, for example. But it does not stop somebody to design a system where, I don't know by which system, he monitors the consumption of water in the truck, for example. Okay, this could be a best practice because it's not meeting a legal requirement, it's just a way to go beyond. It's not, I'm not saying that because the legal requirements do not cover all the situations. You have a number, for example, if you think about the space allowances for pigs, for example, there is actually a small indication for pigs, but there is absolutely nothing for other type of pigs, whatever piglets or for example. So, I mean, if a transporter say, for transporting piglets, this is the density I use, okay, this is the best practice, because it's not part of the legal requirement today. Yeah, you understand the difference, or is it still confused for me?
Well,
Yes, apparently it's still confused.
that when somebody wants to do something that goes beyond the legal requirements as interpreted by the guides under good practice, and if it is not contradictory to the good practice, why that should become an official document in an official guide? Because I see what is going to happen, that there will be certain competent authorities that say, well, we've got a guide and it says best practice, and our interpretation is going to be that you have to fulfill good practice, best practice. If you do not fulfill that, we stop transport. And that is going what happened. I give you an example. You mentioned, I'm very glad you mentioned the temperature of 30 degrees, which is a legal requirement not to go beyond 30 degrees. We had almost transports of day-old chicks stopped because they were going to be transported above 30 degrees. Now, most of the people in this room, I hope, that are working with poultry, know that chicks, day-old chicks, are most comfortable at temperatures just above 30 degrees. Now, that was a Dutch interpretation of a transport guide. And that is, I think, the danger if we get into these discussions.
There's different issues in what you say. The first thing is your fear, okay, that best practices might become the rule, okay? And, okay, I accept that you fear that, okay? But for me, okay, this is why we try to clarify the concept of it, why we have suggested this in the contract. It's not because we want to have additional rules, right? But because the discussion is about transport, and when you have good practice, why not to share this good information? That's the idea. As I said at the beginning, even the good practices will not be legally binding, okay? So, of course, okay, a competent authority may do what they want, okay? But what I mean is that if you have a common document, and this is always all about the discussion about when you elaborate a common document. You know, now today, you are exposed to the arbitrary of one single inspector interpret the way he wants, okay? If you share a document which has some kind of European base, which is not legally binding, it's not even a document. The documents will be produced by this pilot project will not even be approved by the Commission. So it has absolutely no legal status, okay? But it's a common reference, and when you face the arbitrary of somebody, you can say, look, these documents say this and this, okay? So you have some kind of basis to negotiate. Now you are exposed to any arbitrary because there is absolutely no reference. So if this is what you want, okay, but I think you speculate when you think, in my view, you speculate, maybe you're right, okay, because speculation could be right, but in my view, you speculate too much when you think that this will become a standard. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you're correct, but I'm not convinced that this will become the issue, and this is not clearly our purpose. So that's why I want to make clear that, as I say, okay, you can make a statement that, okay, you don't want to share good practices, fine, okay. But what I mean is not really the purpose to change the standard. As I say clearly at the beginning, we are not here to change the legislation. We are not here to negotiate any discussion about the legislation. So this is what you fear, fine. But what I mean is not the purpose. And I think that is a bit sad that if you think that there is a good idea which goes beyond the legislation and it works, not to share it. That's it. So that's the only thing. Now, on the temperature is something else. You might identify, and this I agree with you, that in the regulation they might have some inconsistency or things that are not necessarily practical or consistent with the practice in the sector. That might be correct. And I think, okay, so we are not going to change the legislation anywhere because it's not in the agenda, but I think also it's good for you as part of the process to identify things that are not working in the legislation, even if we are not going to do it. Because if we have practices where we know that in Europe this is the way it's done, and there is a problem maybe with the scientific base or maybe the practical experience with the legislation, well, it's better to identify it rather than say we put your strict policy and say, no, we don't want to see it and we hide it. Okay, we had a number of cases like this, like the transport of fish or whatsoever. I mean, we had a number of things like this. And I think it's important that we stick to the purpose of the legislation, which is to guide the welfare of the animals. And I agree with you, day-old chicks, normally they like to be a bit warm because, I mean, because of physiological reasons rather than being cold. That's clear. But again, I think that by fearing that you share information which sometimes can be good even if it's not in the legislation, well, okay, it's fine, but I think it's a bit, it's a missed opportunity, that's all.
Following the discussion about best practice, good practice, and listening to Mr. Simonin, I have heard only one explanation about how he defines good practice. He has not given any explanation about how he defines best practice. And I got a bit of feeling that how he's defining it, it might be even non-existing practices today. Which means that, of course, then the question is, how are you defining then that something which doesn't exist is the best practice? First of all, we should know that this transport, we have many aspects that are playing a role of how the animal may feel it itself during transport. You understand? So the best practice is not just defining one aspect of the transport, going beyond the good practice as being a best practice, but it's more or less the whole of all the different elements in the transport that define at the end where there is a best practice or not situation. You understand? So, and what we see in practice is, of course, that in some production systems, they are defining some requirements going beyond the law in many elements, not only in transport but also in other issues. So there, of course, it's at the end how these stakeholders or these partners in the poultry value chain finally define what they accept or they consider as the best practice for themselves. And many different criteria may be used and many different arguments may be used to define their own best practice situation. So the difficulty is to define that in a guide that you are, let's say, a bit mixing up what's happening in practice in a way that may bring also other elements in it. It's, for example, emotion. If you talk about best practice which is not existing, what is your criteria to define that as a best practice? It's in my view, very difficult. What you may do is say, okay, we define the good practice, and that you have clearly explained, where the law is clear with strict requirements, then of course you have to comply. Where the law is a bit more flexible in how this may be interpreted, then of course you may define in common understanding with each other what is then the good practice in the interpretation of the law. And then of course you may explain that in practice, in the reality, there are practices that are going beyond this, and you may give an example of what is happening then. But to define it as best practice is very, very risky and very, very complicated. Because at the end, what may happen is then, of course, that only one element is on one aspect you have a best practice, and there are systems maybe with different elements that are going beyond the law. You understand? I hope I have explained a bit the complexity, and I want to avoid that, for example, emotion and subjective elements are playing a role in defining best practice. Could you
Person. I'm representing the German Transport Association for Horses. The way I understood is good practices is supposed to be everything that has to be done in order to meet the legal requirements. Best practices is a guide to what can be done from a practical point of view in order to excel those legal requirements in the legal frame. And that's all there is to it. I mean, we are sitting on tables and we have all people coming from all sectors, so I don't have the fear that we might go in the wrong direction, because actually we create a balance, and that's a great thing, and I think that's the purpose of the whole issue. The only question I have is we have different focus groups. And like he said, he's coming from the poultry sector, and that is a good example with the 30 degrees. For poultry, that's perfect. For horse, it's on the limit, okay? So we all have different outcomes, different results in the guides. And is this going to affect in any way, or will it be reflected at any point in time in the EU legislation? Or how is it going to influence the further developments?
I would like to catch.
Hello, Cecilia from Animal Welfare Foundation. I would like to have a more clear explanation. How are you planning to disseminate these guidelines? More clear, only the fact sheets, or it's going to be like in the future trainings or something? Because if we really want to share all this information and all this work that I think it's really, really valuable, we need to get sure that it arrives to the final users.
From the Humane Slaughter Association UK, at the risk of starting a whole new debate, I'm just thinking, that is the term best practice, should we be using the term better practice? Because best it's a finite adjective. The implication being that if you're doing that, you can't get any better, but actually what might have been considered best practice 20 years ago is no longer that. So maybe we should be using the term better practice rather than best practice.
Like better leader.
From Aviagen Turkey. Just to follow the information from the Animal Welfare Foundation, for me, and I understand my colleague about the fear about the low possibility in the future, I think the trouble is with the dissemination, the way we disseminate that guidelines in the different countries after that, because we don't want to change the law, EU law, okay, but if you give some best practice and you disseminate that to the administration, for example, in different countries, how the different country can change the law in their own country with the best and good practice. It's, I think, the way to translate what my colleague said also. It's not to change the law in EU, but if you put some best practice, I know 2 or 3 countries, for sure, they go to change their own law on that. It's, for example, the French, the Germany, and the Dutch, for sure.
Yes, absolutely.
It's for that reason I think we have some fear about that. It's not because best practice is not best practice, we need that perhaps. But perhaps we can change also the name. It's a good opportunity to do that.
Perhaps would be nice.
Yes, okay, on this discussion, I will try to, okay. I think we should not stick too much on this difference in my view, but just to make it clear, okay, if best practice, let's say we call it like this for the moment, do not exist, we don't ask the contractor to invent it, okay? So the idea is to collect practices that they identify are not meeting any legal requirement, which are good for welfare. That's the point. So it's the opportunity to share information. It's not about creating new rules or inventing things that does not exist. if you don't do anything about a particular thing that is not covered by the legislation, and there is no there is no industry practices on this, well, the contractor will say there is no information on this aspect, full stop, and that's it. So end of the story. So that's, I think it should be clear. The contractor is not asked to invent anything. He's not, and in addition to this, he's not even allowed to dig into scientific publication, some kind of recommendation that come out of the blue, okay? Because scientists can invent fantastic things that are not feasible. What is the framework? This I was very clear from the start that if we speak about best or better practices, it should be something that has been applied by operators. Otherwise, it's out of the field. So it should be at least something that exists. Or otherwise, it's not credible. So. Okay, now on the there is something on the legislation. Now, as I say about the legislation, this with the lady on horses. As I said, okay, you can identify discrepancies or gaps between industry practices and the legal requirement when you have specific ones. The only thing I'm afraid for the moment is I cannot change the legislation. Okay, so. I don't have, neither there is no political support for this, okay, and even technically speaking it would be very, very complicated for the moment, okay. So I think that up to the end of this commission mandate, which is the end of '99, okay, do not expect any legislation whatsoever, even if sometimes it is to make it a bit more realistic or whatsoever. But I think, and this is why I think this could be valuable to share this information, if it's a document, when you have a reference document where you have some nuances in the document saying, look, this degree is maybe not perfectly adapted for some type of animals and so on, then it could help you also to discuss and negotiate with national authority when there is some kind of possible conflict. Because, I mean, inspectors, I've been an inspector in the past, okay, they don't know everything about any animals, okay, it's a bit, so sometimes they may apply the rules because, I mean, this is the rule and that's it. So it's good, especially on horses, you have a lot of specificities that, okay, you also indicate your inspector and say, look, there is an AU project which has developed a number of good practices and they show that actually transporting horses over 31 degrees is still okay. I mean, I don't know, I'm just inventing something stupid. Huh? But okay, so this is about, now on dissemination. There is another phase of the project, which is the last phase of the project. To be honest, I don't remember what is in the contract. Because I drafted a long time ago, 2 years ago, so I mean, maybe you can reply to this answer.
No, I didn't address that, but of course, as part of the project, as I explained, we're trying to reach as many stakeholders as possible with the results of all these discussions on good and best or better practices. The final phase consists of a work package dealing with dissemination. Nancy de Bruyne from FIE heads this work package, she leads it, and you will correct me if I say anything stupid. Basically, there are two main activities. The first main activity is passive dissemination, in a sense that we are very active, but that as a user you may be passive in taking it on board. So we will disseminate by email contacts to various people who are sitting around the table. We of course have established a website, and I hope we can share the address a little bit later on as well. And we will put all the information that we've gathered during the course of this process on the website for people to review. That's the sort of passive way of disseminating, but we hope to reach a large number of people with that. More actively, however, we've agreed with the Commission that we will go and find you in your countries, and also your transporters, your trainers, anybody who's related to transporting animals, by organizing roadshows in 9 countries in Europe. You'll understand that there are financial limits to what we can do, but we've agreed to go to 9 countries where we will set up a roadshow, at least visiting the capital of the country, and then going to 2, maybe 3 locations in the country where we invite small groups of stakeholders and explain to them about the project in their own language. And these are the countries where, of course, we have collaborators in our consortium who can actually do that in, hopefully,